Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody this morning. My name is Wayne Ferguson, Senior Vice President with Ellis Dawn for the Ottawa region, and we are happy to be the sponsor today and introduce decarbonization in construction. So we'll go over to the speakers panel today. We have Jolene McLaughlin, Vice President of Sustainability for Ellis Dawn. We have Gina, Decarbonization Business Lead for Stantec, and Miranda, Technical Specialist with Lafarge Holcim. And then our moderator today will be Finn McDonald from Urban Equation. So over to you guys.
A rickety stage here. Do I need a harness?
Yeah, maybe.
Welcome, everybody. So we're going to kick things off. Welcome to the Decarbonization in Construction session. So my name is Finn McDonald. I work for Urban Equation. For those of you that don't know what Urban Equation is, it's part of the Windmill Development Group here in Ottawa. There I work as an environmental and social and governance consultant, helping with strategy, risk, and financials. I'm going to let each of our panelists tell you just a little bit more about what they do so you can understand why they're here today. So maybe I'll start with Jolene on the left there.
Doesn't sound like it. Oh, there we go. Morning, everybody. Jolene McLaughlin. I'm Vice President Climate and Sustainability for Ellis Dawn. And so my role is to help our project teams work with our clients and figure out what it means to actually decarbonize the buildings and the way we're working.
For Stantec, I'm the Decarbonization Business Lead and Mechanical Lead. We provide all sustainability and decarbonization services for existing and new projects locally and globally. And we have our team here, some members of the team here today. If you're interested to connect afterwards, please make sure you do. Thank you.
Yep. And hello, everyone. My name is Miranda Bennett. I am the Technical Sales Specialist at Lafarge and here in Ottawa. And I have a primary focus on sustainability and our EcoPack concrete, which is a low CO2 concrete.
Great, thanks. So we're going to kick things off with a very, very, very short presentation, just to demystify the subject a little bit for you. So when it comes to the environmental impact of buildings, we spend a lot of our time in buildings, but it is a very significant source of emissions. So globally, it can be around 40%. The number fluctuates a little bit. The most recent study put out by the UN says 39% of global emissions, right? If you think about it, that's bigger than any other industry on the planet. In Canada, the emissions are a little lower. We were very fortunate to have clean electricity, but we still have to use that electricity responsibly, so energy efficiency is still really important. Buildings, whether you're talking about the construction or the operations of those buildings, is about 36% of global energy use. Energy causes emissions. There's a lot to unpack here. You'll see yellow bubbles and blue bubbles. The blue bubbles are the operational carbon. That's the burning of fossil fuels to heat the building, the electricity that keeps the lights on. The yellow bubbles you see is embodied carbon. That's the carbon associated with manufacturing the building materials, whether it's concrete, drywall, or carpet, assembling that on site, the construction process, maintaining it over the life of the building, and then eventually disposing of it through demolition and recycling or landfill. The stars on the bottom just give you an idea of the relative impact. So you can see the use stage, because there's both operational carbon, there's both and embodied carbon, is a bigger impact. But the upfront embodied carbon that comes from the construction and the manufacturing of the building materials is actually quite significant. And we want to talk a lot about that today. When it comes to evaluating these emissions, like if you've ever been to the cereal aisle with your kids, you can look at the nutritional label on the cereal box and find out how good it is for them. An environmental product declaration is kind of the same thing, but it's for building materials. It'll tell you how environmentally friendly a product is. These are also third-party verified in most cases, so you have a level of assurance that they're actually telling you the truth. You can get industry average environmental product declarations. These will sort of form a baseline, so concrete in Ontario, as an example. And then you can look at the product-specific ones to decide if you're getting a high-performance product or not. So your specific eco-packed concrete, for example. Any questions on that? Okay. So let's dive into the panel. I'm going to start with some questions. The first question, I'm going to give this one to Gina to start. So how can the construction industry effectively balance the urgent need for decarbonization with the practical challenges that it faces in terms of materials, costs, and timelines?
Absolutely. So the building sector represents around 38% of the GHG emissions, and this is anticipated around 14 gigatons annually. The decarbonization trajectories that we're looking at is to at least halve them by 2030 and reach the net zero by 2050. So the key actions that we need to do is the first step to conduct whole life carbon assessment. This is really important because we need to understand how much carbon is being emitted over the whole life cycle of the building. Once we do that, the second step would be conducting a life cycle cost assessment, because looking only at the upfront cost will not give us the right message or the right next steps to do. So understanding the metrics, looking at the whole life cycle and looking at the cost is also important. Now, after we do that, the next steps would be putting clear targets for the project. We need to understand the right definition of net zero for an existing project, for a new project, and once we understand the definitions, the boundaries, we're able to really accommodate that. And the larger we work together with the larger stakeholder group, early on, we're able to implement decisions. If we integrate those decisions as we move forward, it will cost us more in terms of design, in terms of the effort, in terms of making sure whether the material, whether the design strategies are implemented. And again, the time is really now. If we are to meet those targets, the projects that are currently being in design will actually be constructed in 2030. So what we can do today will really be seen and regarded and see the emissions of in 2030. Thank you.
I'm going to go to Miranda next.
So materials, cost, and timelines. Can you guys hear me? Okay. With materials, I would say there's a lot of innovative materials that are out in the market, and we need to make sure that as a construction industry that we are utilizing those innovative materials and putting those materials into our projects. There is a misconception in the market that sustainability comes at a cost to construction timelines, and that's just really not the case. Like for us, we have a low CO2 concrete, and it's going to act and perform the same as our old standard concrete, so it's not affecting the construction schedule. However, we have had an increase in cost, unfortunately. So what we're doing with low CO2 concrete is we're simply supplementing cement powder with slag. And slag is a byproduct of the steel manufacturing industry. So they're also trying to be more sustainable, and in their sustainability is causing less byproduct. So we have less product, more demand, the cost has gone up. And what we found in our discussions with developers and owners is that that increase in cost is really only attributing to about 1 to 1.5% of the total project value. So the benefits of having a sustainable project is really outweighing the cost.
Jolene?
So I think kind of summarizing the points from the two other panelists, looking at things up front, looking at them from a whole life cycle perspective, adding value to the carbon reduction and being able to communicate that to our clients so they understand what they're getting, and comparing that to the cost. That's kind of the crux of where we need to go, creating that weight of carbon in line with cost, in line with schedule, so we can start to get a holistic picture of what we're trying to do and what the benefits are.
Great, thanks. And you know, we heard about the target setting, 2030, 2050, the urgency for implementation. If you think about it, you know, the Canadian government released the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change in 2016. It is now 2024. We're beyond halfway to 2030, right? We have less than 70 months until 2030 to hit those 2030 targets. So implementation is key, and you have to start now. And I really liked what Gina said about how the buildings that we're designing now are going to be under construction and will be the buildings that are finishing closer to 2030, right? So if we want our buildings in 2030 to perform as they should, we have to start now. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask the next question, which, in your experience, what are some successful strategies and initiatives that have been implemented that can reduce embodied carbon? So, in construction specifically, and maybe I'll start with Jolene on that one.
Sure, thanks, Finn. So one of the key opportunities that we see is a more collaborative approach to try and address this idea of adding value to carbon or creating value around carbon. So when we pull together our structural engineers, our concrete suppliers, and our site teams to ask the question, okay, what can we do here around schedule? What can we do around mixed design? What can we do in terms of adding SCMs or changing the admixtures? That gives us a full spectrum of levers that we can kind of pull and start to reduce emissions. We've got a project on Vancouver Island where we were able to reduce the embodied carbon by 25% just by doing all of that kind of analysis up front and having those conversations that are traditionally not done because of the way the structure of construction is right now. And so I think we've got to work to fight through some of that consistent process of siloed operation to bring everybody together and start to have those conversations.
Up on what you just mentioned, data is really a key, and we can only do informed decisions if we have enough data and we've gathered all the data from all stakeholders early on. I really think a point of success on all the project is communicating targets. And like we have cost targets and budget targets for the projects, we need to have targets for the carbon early on. So setting the right targets early on and working within those targets, like we do for the cost, is very important. One thing, especially that the topic of embodied carbon has been really so important and so new for all stakeholders, it's important to participate in technical committees or policy making. Part of the work I've been doing with ASHRAE over the past 5 years is contributing to decarbonization guidelines. And in those guidelines, we provide methodologies so that designers, stakeholders, all entities follow these frameworks and understand that if we lack information, what can we do? What are specific factors that we can integrate to get a better sense and compare apple to apple? One last thing I would like to add is that every time we work on projects, we want to understand whether what we're doing really makes sense. So we need to communicate success stories. If we've implemented something, we need to try to make it available so that people will learn and say, well, this has been implemented in this part of the world, we can do similar. We can scale up those approaches and implement them, whether at the level of the material selection, design selection, all throughout the whole life assessment of the 60-year period the building is up and running. So those are really important factors that we look into. Above and beyond are the tools like you mentioned. So we have now a lot of tools available, and they're mostly provided for free, and they're friendly user. You can go in and utilize them and understand what sort of libraries they're available, whether in providing environmental product declaration, whether running those numbers and understanding how much savings is really celebrated early on and could be implemented throughout the project.
I agree with that, and I think collaboration is key here, that we're doing things that we're doing today and getting everyone in the industry together to teach about the new sustainability practices that are out there, and just to make sure that we're all in a line on building better communities in our cities. So it is important that, you know, we are comparing apples to apples when it comes to material selections, but just that everyone is involved together and engaged in the product discussions and the project discussions, so that we know that we're choosing the right materials and we're making the best choices for our projects.
Thank you. And this journey we're on with embodied carbon is still really new to most of the industry, and it is really important to share those stories and those learnings, and even at events like this to have those conversations about what we've been doing, what works, what doesn't, what was really easy to implement and perhaps got a big win. If you think about your energy efficiency at home, right, you can change light bulbs, you can reduce your power bill. Those are easy things you can do. There's easy things you can do here. So the next question is, how can we effectively communicate the importance of embodied carbon reduction, to clients, to contractors, and to other key players within the supply chain? And I'm going to let Miranda start with this one.
I would say, is this the one? So key lessons learned. I would say what
No,
we've
sorry,
learned.
it's the next one. Sorry. Yeah, the slides keep moving on me.
Oh, okay. So where are we?
This one.
How can we effectively communicate? Well, is that not the one that we just answered? Okay, so
Answer.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
ditto
Ditto
from
last
my
answer,
last
yeah.
response,
Yeah.
collaboration, like getting together and doing what we're doing.
I think one of the things that I'm learning is, even though I feel like I've said it 100 times, I need to say it probably 300 or 400 more. So just keeping to communicate, making it really clear. One of the challenges we see is, or I see anyways, is people in similar positions to me, but on the developer side, they are also looking at these targets and saying, oh, it's really important for our projects, but that language doesn't always get all the way down to the project level staff, and I'm sure I'm guilty of the same sort of thing. And so the more we can communicate and say, this is really important, the more the client can highlight to us that it's really important, and we can communicate that down to the supply chain. I think that really helps.
Yeah, for sure, and doing like project knowledge sessions and just really, getting the knowledge out there to everyone who's going to be involved in the building communities on what we have.
I would only add to that, over the past 50 years, we've been working with operational energy, and we've finally found this piece of the puzzle where we do energy modeling, we assess, we cater for these savings. However, the embodied carbon, as it only emerged a few years back, I see two key challenges. The first one is the perception among stakeholders that it's really less immediate target at the moment. Do we really have to meet those embodied carbon targets? Is it mandatory? The second challenge would be the data overload. We usually provide all these metrics to every single stakeholder, and then everyone has to give their opinion, and really we struggle in communicating and explaining what we really mean and how we can get there. So in my mind, I would say the best way to do that is to make them as concise as possible, as clear as possible, just reflect on the few next steps that could be done and implemented in the short term. If we're struggling to implement all at once upfront, why not phase out those implementation strategies over a couple of phases so we can actually get the fruits of our work towards the end of the design phase. And finally, and as Finn and Julie mentioned, those types of collaboration, whether with materials, manufacturers, conferences, training sessions, those are really needed. And I, for myself, with my humble 15 years of experience, I feel that the market is growing quickly. We need to catch up. We need to understand what's out there from tools, from materials. We need to update our business as usual conventional design approaches to new ones and be able to really see the difference and claim the difference. Thank you.
Maybe just a quick follow-up to that. So, we're talking about communicating to different stakeholders, but which stakeholders are, in your experience, generally driving this? Like, somebody's asking for this, right? Who and why?
Everything's got to come from the client. We have emissions targets that our company is set to, and we're working really hard to hit those. We can go up to the client and say, hey, here's an option for you, but if they're gonna say, we don't care, there's nothing we can do about it. So it's gotta start with the clients. We're seeing pressure for them from pension holders in the places where they're getting money. If they aren't complying with environmental and social governance standards and expectations, they are getting higher cost of borrowing or not getting access to the funding at all. And so that's where a lot of what we see as the pressure is coming, and that's kind of where the ownership has to start, at least. We've got to take a piece of it and own our pieces, but it's got to start up there.
I would I would say the world is waking up at the moment, and we see the urgency. I was lucky enough to represent Stantec at COP28 a few months back that took place in Dubai, and I've seen countries globally come in and really commit to net zero targets, various backgrounds and entities, whether agriculture, whether building sector, whether transportation, really agreeing that it's really the time to act and the time to take those commitments. So I would definitely say pinpointing the source of emission, working with that, making sure that those communication gaps are addressed and worked for is really important. Today is the time of action, and I'm reiterating that because it's really important and it's really not hard to implement and understand where we are and how we can meet those targets and exceed them. One interesting thought I have in mind, and we were just discussing this before the start of the panel, is that usually we claim savings from a baseline of ASHRAE 90.1. But if you look at the curve of how 90.1 has grown with time and how more stringent it has become, by 2030 it will be net zero. So if we're currently claiming savings based on the baseline that we're modeling ASHRAE 90.1 2016, by 2030 you're not able to actually claim saving unless you design for net positive. So keeping that in mind really is a wake-up call for us to do things differently.
Yeah, and I can just add to that, like what Jolene's saying about it starts with the client. A lot of times what we're seeing is the client's wanting one thing, but then when it goes through the pipeline and gets down to the production of the project, the sustainability is lost. So it just, you know, we have to make a clear focus of the targets and what we're looking for to make sure that the client is getting what they want at the end of the day, and it doesn't come down to cost, like what's more important here. You know, we should be building more sustainable projects. And you know we're going to have to take a little bit of that cost into effect, but we have to look at the big picture.
Yeah, so just understanding the implications of the decisions we're making, and that's where the cost of carbon comes into.
We've got a little bit of time, so I just want to maybe one or two more quick follow-ups on this because there was a couple things that were said. So, Gina, you were at COP21 or what was it? COP20? 28. Yeah. 28. Time flies. So there's a lot of people in here that perhaps work for companies that would never go to COP28. I imagine there's a lot of multinational companies there that are doing great things, but are there strategies that smaller companies, maybe local companies to Ottawa could implement on their projects without feeling too much of an impact?
I would say every project is unique and each site is unique. But I love the question. I would like to answer it in something iconic that really shocked me when I was at one of the expo showrooms, and the municipality of Dubai actually has 3D printing of their own building of the Dubai municipality. So they used some sort of material based from corn to utilize it in a 3D printing to build one of their buildings. Now, is this implementable and scaled up in other places in the world? I wouldn't say so, because the climate obviously is different. Temperatures go up to 50 degrees C in that region in the world. But it's really interesting to see that it has been implemented, and in a way, it's inhabitable, and people are actually utilizing some sort of wellness and safety within that building. I say that once we speak about these stories, whether on a small scale, whether in a place like Dubai or other places, it's really important to see that and how we can scale it up. Is it something that we can implement here? There are a lot of things that Jolene, like Alisson, are doing here that are not actually implementable in any way in the Middle East or Africa or that region. But putting everybody on the table and having decarbonization and sustainability experts on projects that do not even have a sustainability scope early on, it really brings in the discussion. You can brainstorm together. You can see one interesting exercise that the team does on our project is benchmarking. So we go on a project, and then we have those targets as per the proposal. We want to go by that, but we go out there and we say, well, what's happening in that region? What are the most sustainable targets that has been reached there. Can we meet those? Can we exceed those? And what are the tools and ways that can help us get there? So I think those discussions I saw at COP, those were the discussion, the energy that I saw, that people are actually willing to take those steps to do a difference, and this is what we all need. We just have to move away from, you know, having those questions of, do we really need an energy model? Do we really need tools that would help us understand what's our embodied carbon factor? Yes, we do, and we don't have to analyze that and justify this need. We are at a time where this should go without question.
Yeah, maybe one more quick follow-up, and I'm going to throw this one at Jolene. You know, you mentioned the client drives everything. Let's say you have a client and they don't know anything about this. Are there some solutions that perhaps you could sit them down and be like, this isn't going to cost you more, it isn't going to impact schedule, you'll get the exact same quality, would you like to do this? Because I feel like if you can do those things, most people, when presented with an option that's, you know, greener, if it doesn't cost more and they get the same thing, they'll probably do it, right? It's when it costs more, it becomes a sticking point, right? So I'm just curious, in your experience, if there is anything like that.
Yeah, so one tangible example that we're testing out is working with our concrete supply partners. I see Tomlinson in the room as well, and trying to get, when we go out to tenders, saying, okay, here's your mixed designs. Tell us what you would normally do. What's the cost implications, the schedule implications, what would be the carbon impact of that? Then tell us what you could do if cost wasn't an object and we were just focused on low carbon as an option. And then give us some examples of something in the middle that might also help either way. The idea is to take the results of that, use it as part of our bid leveling process to say, okay, here's where the different bidders combine on schedule, on cost, on whatever. But by the way, client, if we do, you know, change this mix and make it a 56-day because it's on the foundations and we aren't going to build on top of it very quickly, and then we do something over here with more SCMs, we're going to end up reducing the emissions by this much, and it's going to cost you, maybe it's 1% more, maybe it's nothing more, and a lot of times we do find options that are cost effective or have zero additional cost. Then that's where that conversation comes back to. You know, we can all do something that's better by thinking about it a little bit more holistically.
Great. I heard the acronym SCM. Does one of you want to take a stab at defining that in layman's terms for people?
Yeah, so basically when we're talking about concrete and we're talking about a low CO2 concrete, we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just making a better product. We're taking our standard mixes and we're using less cement powder and more slag, as we spoke about. And what we're getting is at least a 20% reduced carbon product that's performing the same as our standard old mixes. We've actually evolved too since we've started 3 years ago, and we're making a high early low CO2 concrete. So as I mentioned before, a lot of the fear in the market is that if we use a low CO2 concrete, it's going to affect our construction schedule. Well, we've defied those odds because with the high, early, low CO2 concrete, we're able to get 75% of the strength in that mix in just 3 days. So we've made great strides to be able to have a product, low carbon product in the market for the construction industry.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna reuse my sheet because the slides keep moving on me. So we'll move on to the next question. So collaboration is often key to addressing complex challenges, right? And we did hit on that earlier. So how can various stakeholders, and by stakeholders I mean government, industry professionals, and even the public, work together to help drive decarbonization in the construction sector? And I think I'll start with Gina on this one.
A lot of the information I had in mind to communicate, but let me tell you about one tool that our team has been working on for some time now, and it's really exciting because, you know, the first thing that comes to our mind when onboarded on a project is that what is the minimum that we need to do? So we've came with the idea of understanding how the region globally and locally looks like from a commitment perspective for the GHG emissions, so that every time we're onboarded on a project, the first thing we need to communicate the minimum requirement. Now, you might come and tell me that, well, what if the minimum requirement is not as stringent? That's a very important question, because this is where the tool can tell us what's happening right adjacent to the place where the project or the region of the project is taking place. And if we see a lot of growth or stringent targets growing around, we understand that the future is going to be near when those carbon intensities will be set firm, and then we need to comply by them. So this type of education to us as consultants and then to our clients will help make those informed decisions about what we need to do next. The most important thing that we are working with is those communication gaps. So we understand that every single entity or throughout the value chain, there are some sort of entities well aware, others are less aware or see it less immediate. So what we try to do is we utilize existing tools, and then we have our own internal tools and sheets that would help us understand what is a very preliminary number of those carbon metrics. And then as the design grows, and the more we get information from the material, environmental product declaration, the quantities, we update this work so that in each phase we see those numbers, and we try as much as possible to move towards a decarbonized approach, an approach where we're making sure it's safe, we're making sure structurally it's feasible, but we are doing our best in terms of integrating the best options for low embodied carbon. Thank you.
Okay, I'll go to Miranda next, and I'll read the question again for you because the slides aren't up. So collaboration is often key to addressing complex challenges. How can various stakeholders, government, industry professionals, and the public work together to drive decarbonization?
Yeah, so I would say collaboration is needed in adopting more sustainable byproducts to Canadian standards. We are only able to work with what's been approved by CSA, and if we had more products that could be offered and could be added to our mixes, we could be closer to a net zero concrete.
I think that's a good point too, Miranda. We're trying to work with NRC on the CSA standards specifically around concrete, knowing that they have limitations on the volume of supplementaries we can use, but also looking at we get spam at least once a week about some innovative concrete material that's going to save the world that we need to vet, but then we need the standards to approve as well. So there's some pieces there that definitely need some support. We have seen some action federally at the government level. And some of the municipalities, both the City of Toronto and the City of Vancouver, are doing a lot to kind of push the conversation on embodied carbon. So the federal government has their standard in place for any project. I think it's over $20 million with concrete. We have to, as the builder, we have to report on the as-built condition, and they're looking for us to show that it's 10% reduced in emissions from a baseline target. They also have, they're working on shifting that so that steel gets counted in that conversation, and then looking at it at the whole building level as well. But so then they're creating standards around how we evaluate that whole building level. So we are seeing some leadership, and with the federal government being a big client for everybody here, it's good to see that movement. If we can get them working together, that makes things a lot easier for all of us too. And so that's another piece of collaboration just internally in the government, just working together better.
Great, thanks. And this is Ottawa. Obviously, government is the biggest business in town. I'm just curious specifically about the government. If you haven't read it, you should check out the Greening Government Strategy. They have a strategy for buildings. You can go onto the Treasury Board website, check it out. It's a paragraph or two. They're doing all kinds of great things. But one thing that they're doing is they've created the life cycle assessment guidelines to help quantify embodied carbon, which provide the framework that consultants operate under and provide a standardized way of doing it. I was just wondering if you could, perhaps one of you could chat about how that might have an impact on the industry to have that standard in place.
We're interestingly, we're finding that a lot of embodied carbon guidelines are now available, and that's part of my discussion on data overload. But the important aspect I would like to mention is that now it's being recognized and now it's really being implemented and set. So I would like to mention that we as consultants, we are ready. We're well-versed utilizing tools. We're well-versed with looking at the whole life carbon assessment. Actually, we're even beyond that because we're working with policies to look at this whole life carbon assessment. If you're more aware about this, and also speaking to the guideline adopts the European Standards 15978, which was adopted by ASHRAE, which was adopted by SIPSI. Now, previously, this whole life cycle assessment looked only at operational carbon and embodied carbon. Lately, if you look at the guidelines by RECS, you'd notice that a new category has been integrated, which is the user carbon. So now we're working with 3. The user carbon is under the module B. I won't go too technical, but this is to tell you that the more we move forward, the more we're regarding the emissions we're moving about. The user carbon is basically the carbon that is regarded around a specific boundary of transport, for example. If you are living in a building with a high-rise building and utilizing specific transport, the carbon from the transport needs to be integrated within the boundary of assessment that we're working with. So implementing guidelines and understanding those guidelines are mandating us to utilize those tools to conduct this assessment and have those informed decisions early on is important, and we need all entities mandating that and working with us to have those case studies and those projects really clarified and shared with everyone so that we would cater for these success stories and implement scalably and on larger prototypes as well. Thank you.
I think what Gina mentioned about shareability is pretty key. We've talked about this being a really new space and everybody's trying to figure out what all of it means. And so if we can have some sort of standard guideline that kind of frameworks how things should be approached, that makes it a little bit easier for all of us to kind of follow the same path, to follow the same direction, and at least gives us a jumping point to kind of shift things to. We know we're going to have to increase targets and make things more difficult or meet harder targets. But if we aren't starting at the same spot, it's going to be that much harder to actually get anywhere. So that's why I think that's a valuable standard.
Okay, and you know, the standards that the federal government is putting in place, you know, I think their end goal is to eventually integrate these types of calculations into the bidding process for large infrastructure projects, including highways and buildings and things like that. So creating this standard way that everybody has to do it allows for fair bidding, right? And what I've witnessed was a lot of people working together in the industry on that, right? And that's sort of that collaboration we were talking about earlier. We probably have some time to take some questions from the audience, but I have one more question before we do that. Embodied carbon was really only started to be talked about around 2017 in Canada. There were some people doing it earlier than that. I would say it's really taken off in the last 2 to 3 years, but some of us have been at it for about 5 years. So if you could go back 5 years and give yourself some advice, because I'm sure there are some people in this room who are, you know, maybe they're hearing about it for the first time, maybe they've just heard about it and they're getting started. What advice would you give to yourself and perhaps them if you could go back 5 years? And I don't really have an order for this question, so feel free to.
The advice I would give to myself would be to stockpile slag. I would say educate earlier, you know, just really get out there and embrace the green movement because it's here. We don't have to look far to see other countries, like you mentioned, the European Union, to look at what they're doing in Europe to know that we're far behind on where we need to be for sustainability. So just really getting out there and making that push forward instead of standing back and just kind of being on the sidewalk and waiting for someone else to go first. We have a few leaders in the industry, but you know, just to be more of a leader and embrace the change that's coming because the green movement is here.
I would say similar. Trying to do even a little bit is better than waiting for somebody else to tell you how to do it. And there are some easy things and straightforward things that we can start doing now. Just thinking about what your work is a little bit differently. Whenever you can use less, you're already being more sustainable. And by the way, that ends up saving money a lot of times. So if we can start looking at things through that lens, it helps us move forward. And when you can share that, even that little bit that you're doing, even though if it doesn't feel like enough, I have to tell myself this regularly, it's something, and it helps to give other people the encouragement to try something too.
So I would think of 3 key steps that I can do if I'm currently now looking back at 5-10 years. The first thing I would do basically is reevaluate those projects, because again, you can still conduct this work on existing buildings. So first thing is reevaluation, and it's doable. We're currently working on these types of projects. The second thing is adopting LCA tools. The more we adopt, it doesn't have to be only one tool. There's a lot of ample tools with ample libraries that are being updated with interesting environmental product declaration. So the more we have those tools integrated with our process of work, that's better. And the third and most important, updating the procurement policies. We really need to make sure that our teams and our stakeholders are aware with how the market materials is maturing. It's being matured on a weekly, if not daily basis. And the more we understand and work together and understand what we can integrate in these projects, the better. One final note is that really it's never too late to do the right choice and to do the right decision. You can definitely work with a cost-effective budget and still do the right choice and make sure that you're meeting those commitments and exceeding. And we have a lot of clients that at some point in time, we were able to have those interesting savings that were reflected in a dashboard, and this dashboard is continuously being branded and shown online. And we might think about it that, well, how is this dashboard helpful? Well, if we see the success stories of others, it will definitely be inspiring to us and our clients to take this step and not be really afraid of change. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I think that one thing that I would add to that, if I was going to abuse my power as moderator, is just don't wait for the data. I mean, if you wait for the data, you'll never do it, right? So like, we've seen embodied carbon start off as structural and envelope. We're now seeing things like countertops and things like that be measured. We're going to eventually see mechanical equipment and heat pumps. We're going to start to think about embodied carbon of those. We've got data for concrete. We're doing great things with concrete. We don't have data for heat pumps. So let's not wait for the data. Let's come up with an estimation, and let's just start doing it and getting used to the process, because it's a chicken or an egg thing. Sometimes you just have to crack an egg. We're going to take questions from the audience now. So I think what I'll do, if someone has a question, maybe if I can get this microphone out, I'll come to you and you can ask it. You can all have your own microphone, and I'll go down here. I need to get off this thing. It's not safe.
Thank you, ladies. I have a question. What role does prefabrication have in the strategies?
Take it. Prefabrication can do a lot, especially if we're talking about precast concrete. The controlled environment gives us some more leverage on how to change it. I think the industry on the precast side is really starting to dig into, creating EPDs, looking at how they can improve their processes and reduce emissions, and sensor technology being one of the key things. When we step outside of the concrete space and we're just looking at prefabrication in general, it again is beneficial because we can control the environment where the materials are being made. If you can use processes that don't require fossil fuels to heat or to do whatever sort of manufacturing you need, that's already heading in the right direction. And the more we can change those processes, the lower the embodied carbon becomes. And so then the better off we are in the end.
Anyone have anything to add to that, or? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. When you were talking about how, we want to see this from our clients, we want them to push it down and Frankly, we're not. We have a handful of clients that are pushing it down. I work in the geotechnical foundation construction industry. It really makes me wonder what's happening in Canada. We have CSRD in Europe coming into play. We have California legislation and SEC legislation in the States pushing companies to report Scope 1, Scope 2, and also Scope 3, having science-based targets for federal contractors in the United States, of all places. Is this coming for Canada? How do we get our clients there? And is it coming from a regulatory environment, which I hope? So if you could answer that, would be great. Thanks.
So Finn talked a little bit about the federal government's greening government strategy. Part of the requirement in there is for any governmental partner who is working on any sort of bidding item that's over 25 million, they want you to be part of their net zero challenge, which requires you to annually report on your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, starting to report on your Scope 3, and then show reductions towards those. So the feds do have something in place for their own contracts coming out. I mentioned City of Vancouver and City of Toronto are also doing quite a bit around what can be done in their own buildings, and the City of Ottawa is also trying to do some stuff too. But the biggest push I think I'm seeing is actually from the pension holders through any of the REITs or any of the developers there. They're also asking us, like, what can you do to help us reduce the embodied emissions of our projects, whether it's reducing the materials or as a site access or site process, getting off of diesel fuel, trying to shift to biofuels, trying to reduce the use of fuels using solar, all of these different things that we're all trying to kind of explore and make sure the market has available. So it is coming. It's not as fast as some of the other areas, but the pressure from those reporting regulations is also starting to hit Canadian companies too. So it's here, just not as loud.
Thank you. I don't even know if I needed the mic, but Stephen from Ocean Steel. We touched a lot on the concrete parameters, which is great because parameters, there's no one answer to all the different scopes. As a steel fabricator, what parameters are you pushing from the net zero buzzword to maybe the possible fabricators in the room that we can help you kick back to the market, because the owners are giving you a net zero requirement and then coming to your subs on the fabrication side, and we're unsure what that answer looks like. And then when it comes to bid date on a lump sum, it really just goes back to low price wins, and it kind of gets swept under the rug. So is there any parameters that you're talking about from a steel scope? That'd be great. Thank you.
Lump sum is the problem word there. We can't be innovative when we're all trying to fight for price, right? But with concrete, the biggest piece of the emissions comes from cement production. With steel, the biggest piece of the emissions is at the mill, so the fabricators have less impact overall. We are trying to figure out how we can encourage the mills to report on and reduce their emissions. We know the federal government's working on that as well. But the way the procurement market works for steel, it's tough for us to say, okay, we only want ArcelorMittal products from this specific mill, because it causes schedule issues and supply challenges. And so the more we can work together as an industry to figure out how to get those levers going, the better. It does come back to what I said about the prefabrication piece too. If you can change your processes at your sites, make them use less fossil burning equipment, be more efficient with your energy, all that sort of stuff, then that makes your end production better. And the requirements, they start at the top and they kind of roll down, so eventually they will come down to you guys too.
I guess just touching on the parameters, like I think everybody in the room always tries to do better today than we were doing yesterday or 5 years ago is one of the questions. And kind of if a GC approaches us and says, is there steel net zero, like kind of what does that look like from your requirement?
So net zero steel is, there's a producer in Sweden called Hybrid that's actually looking at it. I believe it's hydrogen powered mills to reduce the emissions. It's very, very limited supply. So we know that zero carbon steel doesn't exist right now, but it's having those EPDs, which then give you the data to support, what your current product is now, and then it gives you the benchmark so that you know how to reduce in the future. And that's where you start to pull in those factors of using less gas, using less material to create the same product, all of those sorts of pieces. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, we talked earlier about how Canada has a lot of clean electricity, right? So if there is a production facility with an electric arc furnace, that would be clean electricity in the production process versus something that might be powered with coal, for example, a blast furnace.
I would like to add one more thing. This metric really astonished me every time I think of it. The embodied carbon emissions are mostly spent before we actually occupy the building. So the upfront carbon in terms of building a building is more than 57% before actually occupying the building. So the carbon intensive process of getting all the material, manufacturing, transporting, and getting them to site, constructing the building, you've already spent your budget before the life cycle of spending your time in the building and operating it and utilizing the energy inside it. So all the measures in terms of making sure this process is as sustainable as possible, you're really working on a big number that could be reduced. And if you can do something about that, that would be a key in terms of affecting the whole life cycle impact of reduction.
I think we probably have time for another question, if there is one. We've got two hands up, so I'll take you both.
As an architect, I got a lot of competing challenges on a project. Embodied carbon, sustainability are just one. Often I sit in these meetings and I'm listening to this and I get its importance. However, it goes off on tangents that are so hard to understand that the clients who are actually financing it don't want to be involved, or it's just something that gets pushed to the side. I'm thinking, is there a way we can simplify the process where we look at a building type, construction material types, and say, here's how much carbon you're going to have per square foot, so that we can start a scorecard and say we're headed down this road, which is really easy for the people, decision makers, to make decisions around. Because right now it seems so vast that we can't comprehend it and we ignore it.
It's an excellent question. It's basically, the answer of your question will be in the 6 decarbonization guidelines that will be published, and some of them are actually now up and available online. I definitely agree having those carbon intensity factors, similar like when you have the energy use intensity, when you want to compare the operation of your building to a specific baseline and understand, am I doing well? What am I comparing to? So I think that as long as you have those carbon intensity factor in place and set early on, the more you can do and work around. One thing I noticed that would be interesting for the client and all the team members, various disciplines, is to be able to model options. Once you model the baseline and then model options, it could be as simple as modeling the building envelope, right? It's impacting the operational carbon, but it's just an example to show you if I model a specific external wall versus a more insulated wall, what is the savings that I have for the operational energy? And it's the same thing when it comes to embodied carbon. It's the same thing when it comes to the whole approach. So working with all disciplines as an architecture, mechanical, electrical, even the PVs. If you come to think about it, if I want to have solar PVs on site, well, I'm manufacturing the PVs. The PVs are material that is being manufactured, extracted, transported to the site and actually contribute to embodied carbon. So when we come in, we have to be able to look at both the impact of operational carbon over the 60-year life cycle and the embodied carbon aspect and see what would be the right decision of an overall reduced metric of carbon. There's no one answer to your question, but I think it's doable. We've been doing that, and even like with the tools that are now available, it could be determined.
But this is my point. Even in this answer, you're mixing operational and embodied carbon construction. And I think it's easier to separate the two. And actually, there's been a lot of good work done on the operational. That you can model exactly what you said. But if I'm sitting there saying, I can do this building with steel or concrete, it's X number of square feet. There's other factors I don't play into it. But if I could say the carbon is one over the other, and if manufacturers can show that they've got less carbon through their operation or manufacturing process,
Definitely, and that's basically the key, having this roadmap all over and looking at both the material and the quantity, but making sure when we say the whole life cycle carbon, you cannot separate the embodied from operation. The key decisions that are done cannot be only look, I know we've filled the missing piece of the operational carbon, but there are decisions like any building system, whether it's an MEP system, whether it's a PV system, whether it's only the envelope, we cannot only look at embodied carbon alone without looking at its efficiency all over the whole life cycle of the building.
So I think I'd look at it a little bit differently to say, you're absolutely right, we've got to get to a point where we can say, okay, you've got to be here, that's the line. Because this is such a new space, we don't really understand it as well as we do energy modeling. We've had 20, 30 years of energy modeling, and that's why we're where we are. But you're right that we got to get there for the embodied carbon piece. But we can't look at it without looking at the full life cycle either, because if we're just looking at the first instance, we're not looking at the whole picture. We do have some tools to be able to say, notionally, heading in the right direction, is this better concrete, steel, or timber? That has to be done really early in design phases. And then the more detailed exercises come later as we have more details about the building. I would say that there are institutions and organizations working at that benchmarking activity and limits for carbon. City of Vancouver is looking at releasing some new data around, you've got to be under 400 kilograms of CO2 per square meter, just so that benchmark is coming there. The Zero Carbon Building Standard already has that in play, right, Finn? And they're looking at adjusting that too. So that might be a good place for you to kind of do a bit of research and understand a little bit better, but I'm happy to chat after too.
There was one last question. We'll take that, and then we'll wrap.
So maybe this is a bit of a cynical question, but I'm going to ask anyway. But is there any concern that these targets are like a little too aggressive, or that they're not achievable in the time frames that we're looking at? And if we don't hit them, what then?
I don't like to think about that is the reality. I hope that we're just making enough foundational steps that will allow us to kind of propel and move a little bit faster, with the optimistic view that we're going to get there eventually, and before it's too late.
Reflect that not in a technical way. I would reflect it on honestly thinking of the simplest definition of sustainability, that making sure that this planet is habitable for our kids. I have 2 kids of my own. Over the summer, I traveled back to the Middle East, and the temperature went up to 52 degrees Celsius, and we weren't able to actually go outside. When we went outside, we were coughing, and it was not livable. So every time we think of the disasters, the fires across Canada, the hurricanes across the US, the heat waves across the Middle East, I think this is a reminder for us to think that those stringent targets are now mandatory and we don't have a choice.
Back to what I was mentioning earlier about making sure that we have enough materials that are being approved by Canadian standards. So you're right, it is a very aggressive target, and we're going to need a lot of help making sure that we have all the materials in place to make sure that we can reach those targets. Without that, we're just running towards a goal.
Great. On behalf of Ottawa OCA and our gift sponsor, JD Brule, we'd like to thank the panel and the moderator for a great discussion today. Obviously, a lot of work to do, but obviously a lot of information to intake as well. And for those guests, obviously the lunch is in the hall towards the back wall there. So obviously everybody's welcome to lunch, and we'll see you guys there. Thank you very much.